Welcome to today's episode of Inside Legal ESG. We are extremely privileged to have with us today Professor Alex Edmans. He is the Professor of Finance at London Business School, a Director of American Finance Association, an Emeritus Professor of Business at Gresham College, a non-executive director for the Investor Forum. He served as Assistant Professor of Finance at Wharton, and he was named Professor of the Year by Poets and Quants. His TEDx talk on the social responsibility of business has garnered 2.5 million views. And on his website, he is described as focusing on purposeful business, sustainable investing, corporate governance, and behavioral finance. Welcome, Professor Edmans.
Thanks very much, Pam. It's a huge privilege to be here.
I think I mentioned to you that my first introduction to you was when your book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, was part of the recommended reading list of my graduate program at the University of Toronto. And as you know, I have been enamored with your thinking and your approach, and I've been following you on LinkedIn since then. For those who have not yet had the opportunity to read the book, briefly describe the premise of the book and perhaps more importantly, what prompted you to write it?
Certainly. Well, a good place to start is probably to explain what I mean by the pie. So the pie is the value that a company creates, and that can be divided between profits to investors and value to society in the form of fair wages, fair prices, fair taxes, protection of the environment, and so on. And so what prompted me to write the book is many executives have the pie splitting mentality, where they view the pie as fixed. And if the pie is fixed, then the only way to increase profits is to reduce the slice that goes to wider society. So that could involve paying lower wages, price gouging to customers, and polluting the environment. But what I wanted to highlight is that the pie can be grown. So when a company is, for example, to invest in its workers, it's not being charitable, it's not just donating pie to it, it's actually growing the pie because the workers become more motivated, more productive, more likely to stay, and then ultimately profits increase. And so why is that so important? It highlights that purpose has not just a moral and ethical case, but a business and financial case. So it's not only good for wider society, but it's good for the long-term success of a business. And I think that's important because when often people think about purpose, and you can see this in the politicization in the US, people think about it as only being good for wider society, but something that serious business people should not pay attention to. But what I want to highlight is if you want to run your company successfully, at least for the long term, you do need to pay a lot of attention to these stakeholder issues.
And so how did you do the research that led to those conclusions? I mean, that's a really big question and a big conclusion.
Well, first, I appreciate you asking this question, Pam, because the research is really important. Because without research, it would just be wishful thinking. So the idea that you can have win-wins and both sides benefit, that's something that you could probably write a book about that and have it not backed up by research. Why? Because of this idea of confirmation bias. So if you give a message that people would like to be true, they will just lap this up uncritically. Even if there's not evidence, you could just hand select a couple of anecdotes and people will believe this. But my day job as a business school professor is research, and importantly, this is large scale research across hundreds of companies and dozens of industries. And importantly, I started this research over 15 years ago. And why I highlight that was that 15 years ago, there wasn't pressure to find that responsibility pays off, right? CSR or ESG or whatever you call it, it wasn't popular. Right now, if you wrote a study finding that ESG pays, yes, it's going to be bandied around in the news, but that wasn't the case back then. Mm-hmm. So let me just go through one of the studies that I looked at. So I wanted to look at the link between employee satisfaction and long-term shareholder value. So why did I define my value, my measure of stakeholder capitalism as employees, not the environment, because climate change is important? Well, climate change is important, but it matters in some sectors, let's say energy, more than others, let's say tech. whereas employees, they matter in every organization. And what I found was the 100 best companies to work for in America. So these are companies that went above and beyond in how they treated their workers. They beat their peers in terms of shareholder return over a 28-year period. So it wasn't just a flash in the pan. It wasn't just true in good times, but not in bad times. And then I had to do some work to look at, is it correlation or causation? Is it employee satisfaction that causes the company to do well? Or is it once a company is already doing well, then it can spend money on its employees? And because I was able to suggest that the causalities was from the former to the latter, from employee satisfaction to firm performance, that suggests if you invest in your employees, that does grow the pie and lead to higher long-term returns.
And hence the book.
Absolutely. And so that was only one piece of research. And obviously you don't want to draw too much from one single study. Instead, you want to look at scientific consensus. But then I drew from other studies, some by me, but some by other scholars. And these are not just scholars in finance. These might be scholars in accounting, economics, strategy, organizational behavior. So I wanted to make it multidisciplinary. Obviously, as an economist, I believe that economics is useful to understand business, but business is wider, far wider and deeper and broader than just economics. I wanted to look at other disciplines as well. And also not just academics, but also practical examples of how companies put this idea of purpose into practice.
And so what has changed since you wrote the book in the world of CSR or ESG?
I think a couple of things have changed. Some have changed for the better, and some have changed for the worse, as is true with many things. So I think what has changed for the better is I think this idea of CSR or ESG is becoming even more mainstream. And in particular, this term CSR is rather outdated and you don't hear it so much anymore. So CSR, or corporate social responsibility, has the connotation of it being something that you just delegate to a CSR department. So they just deal with the CSR, the core business gets on with making money. But in many companies, it's now the CEO or even the CFO who really is embracing purpose. They need to make sure that the way the business makes money is one that serves society rather than taking from it. So I think that's positive. It's become mainstream rather than seen as niche. I think what's negative is, unfortunately, it's become more polarized and more political. For example, in the US, it seems that Republicans are supposed to be anti-ESG by claiming it's at the expense of profits. And that's something where I have some sympathy, in that companies do need to make profits for their investors. And on the other hand, you have Democrats in general who say, oh, ESG is the best thing, it's the most important thing. Companies need to save the planet. In reality, I think both sides are more right than their opponents would argue, and also more wrong than they would think. So I think companies do need to serve wider society, but they also do need to generate returns. And that was the reason why I wrote this book, Grow the Pie, is that are there ways in which businesses can serve both. So I find the opposition from the Republican side to be rather illogical, because if indeed ESG, or whatever you call it, creates long-term returns and supports the long-term success of a business, that's something that any Republican should fully support. And also, I feel that the bashing of business by some on the opposite side is also premature, because business can, if properly run, create social good, and we do need businesses to be profitable, because without that, then shareholders like pension funds wouldn't be able to get returns. So I wrote the book to try to reduce the polarization. Obviously, not everybody in the world reads the book, which is why I love this opportunity to get this message out. And one of the messages I wanted to say is, regardless of your political persuasion, this idea of purposeful business is something that you should embrace. And unfortunately, the polarization that you've seen is moving in the opposite direction from what I was hoping it would go.
You're so right to comment on that, because I think both sides are at the far end of the extremes of the spectrum, when in fact they're both arguing the same point, but from the opposite ends of the spectrum. So your insights on that are great. Talk to me a little bit about the increasing regulation around ESG disclosures and carbon reductions, obviously they're quite advanced in the EU and the UK, still to be
Mhm.
coming in the US, presumably by the SEC. Are those a good thing, or will they encourage, the bare minimum simply to comply and nothing more?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, an important one, Pam. So, in general, I'm very supportive of regulation. So, even though I believe in business as a force for good, I don't believe that capitalism should be unfettered. I believe that any serious economist should have a large role for regulation because you should recognize that markets fail. And indeed, there's an entire chapter, chapter 10 in the book, which is devoted to the positive role that regulation can play. However, I think the role for regulation is to ensure that markets work by addressing market failure. And some market failures may include externality, so we don't have a global carbon tax. Another market failure might be a monopoly. So if we don't have competition, then it can be that companies can mistreat their workers and customers and they can't go anywhere else. To me, ESG disclosure, it's not clear to me that that is a role that regulators should play. And that might seem a bizarre thing for me to say because it might seem a no-brainer that we want more disclosure, because without disclosure, how do we know which companies are truly responsible rather than greenwashing? But the problem with disclosure is that you can only really disclose quantitative measures of ESG or purpose, and many dimensions of purpose are qualitative. So let's take, say, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's something I care about a lot, just intrinsically as an ethnic minority, in addition to any effect on firm performance. Now, you can force companies to disclose things such as the percentage of females on the board or in the wider workforce, also the percentage of ethnic minorities, although that's a little bit more tricky because that's slightly harder to define. But there's so many other dimensions of diversity than just gender or ethnicity. For example, you could be a white male who was the first in your family to ever go to university, or from a different socioeconomic background. In the UK in particular, there's a lot of regional inequality between London and the southeast and the north, but that's something which would not show in most diversity statistics. And also, I mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it could be that you just tick the box in terms of diversity, but do nothing to make sure that these employees feel included and psychologically safe. So I think an analogy here is to the No Child Left Behind Act in the US about 20 years ago, where we wanted disclosure. And here it was disclosure of school performance. So, and the language is very similar. It could help capital allocation, right? You could, as a school district, allocate more funds to outperforming schools and close down underperforming schools. And what happened there was they reduced education, which is a multifaceted, wide set of objectives. So it's not just test scores, but the ability to think critically, the ability to respect opposing viewpoints. And that was whittled down to standardized tests. So what happened was there was teaching to the test. And I think this is what might happen also with ESG. So, what's the solution? I don't think the solution is to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that disclosures are completely meaningless. I do think there are certain things that can be disclosed in a relatively clear form, such as carbon emissions. But for other things, we should understand that the disclosure is only a small part of the picture, such as diversity in terms of demographics does not capture socioeconomic or cognitive diversity. And therefore, I think we should look at ESG disclosures like we do with quarterly earnings now. So with quarterly earnings, why they were introduced, whatever decades ago they were, that was a single common measure. But we now recognize that the value of a company is far beyond just its quarterly earnings. If the quarterly earnings have gone up, we don't immediately cheer. We ask, well, why did they go up? Was it that you cut research and development? And similarly, if one company has a lower carbon number than another or a higher diversity number than another, we shouldn't automatically think that that company is better. It may well be, well, it cut its carbon emissions, but it was actually producing worse local chemical pollutants or using more water or producing more waste in other fields. Maybe it was doing some box ticking diversity and not equity and inclusion. So I think, yes, data is useful, but data is only the start of the picture. It's only a tip of the iceberg.
Wow, that was a lot. And I completely agree. I think it's so hard to quantify so many of the elements of ESG that disclosure isn't really going to be the answer. There's lots of ways we have to look at this and see whether we're making progress. What?
And I think
Go ahead.
sorry, Pam, to interrupt. I think why people sort of like disclosure is, let's say you didn't think about ESG for decades, and you suddenly realize, hey, there's this big ESG thing. Let's get active in it. Disclosure doesn't require you to have expertise, right? You could just see which numbers are higher and say, okay, well, this company's doing better. It's just like if I have no knowledge of ice hockey, right? I can't actually scout and watch players play and pass and so on. I can still say, oh, this person has got more goals or more assists, and say, well, this is a better player. So when you reduce something to some numbers, it is a way of allowing people to sort of get on the act without much expertise, and that's a good thing in a way, in that it makes it more accessible. But then if it leads to more simplistic decisions when expertise is necessary, then it can actually backfire.
Absolutely. So you've touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation when we talked about politics, but what frustrates you in the ESG space? What do you wish were better understood?
Well, I think one thing that might frustrate me in the ESG space is actually the term ESG. Now, you might think, well, that's crazy. Am I not an ESG advocate? But one of my recent papers is called The End of ESG. And you might think, well, why would an ESG advocate write a paper with that title? It's for two reasons. So first, what I want to highlight is that ESG should not be seen as niche. So what frustrates me about the ESG term is it's seen as something that only ESG professionals should care about, not mainstream business people, or only the left should care about and not people on the right. But if indeed ESG is a way of creating long-term financial and social value, that's something that can be embraced. So I don't think it should be seen as special and niche. But also, what frustrates me about the term ESG is that people see it as special on the other side. So some people put ESG on a pedestal compared to other important aspects of a company, like its productivity, like its innovation, like its capital allocation. So if you are a company and you sort of announce this diversity scholarship program, you get huge plaudits in the media. Well, that's a good thing. And I'm somebody who obviously cares about diversity as an ethnic minority. But if a company was to innovate or to reorganize production in a way that cuts costs and also reduces the resource usage for the environment, it's not going to get as many brownie points. If you're an investor and you push a company to disclose a report on the use of plastic packaging, then you're seen as a really conscientious investor. But if you're an investor and you stop a company wasting money on really bad acquisitions, that's not something which gets as much good brownie points. So I think ESG is important, but I would say it's as important as are the drivers of long-term value. But the ESG label, to some people, it means that it has no importance, and to other people, it seems to be the only thing which is important. And again, this is the polarization and the extremism that both you and I have argued is not helpful to these discussions.
And so is there an answer? If we get rid of the term ESG, what are you envisioning as a replacement?
So I either just talk about long-term value or intangible assets. So why long-term value? I think all companies should try to create long-term value. Now you can create that with ESG things, such as ensuring that you reduce your environmental impact, that you treat workers with dignity and respect. But you can also create long-term value through excellence, through innovation, through good management. Or you can think about these as intangible assets. And so why is that an alternative? So why did even the ESG term come about? Because ES and G are seemingly contradictory, because E and S is about serving wider society, But often corporate governance is how to make sure that a company acts in shareholders' interests. And I think why all these three terms came together about 15, 20 years ago was people realized that the value of a company was not just tangible assets like
Mhm.
plants and machines, but also intangible assets like its governance, like its relationship with society and with employees. But I would say there's also other good, important intangible assets like your brand, like your patents. And so I'd see ESG as no better or no worse than these other intangible assets. Indeed, my paper on employee satisfaction that I mentioned earlier, I did not include the term ESG even once. The title of the paper was Does the Stock Market Fully Value Intangibles? Employee satisfaction and equity prices. So I saw employee satisfaction not as an ESG factor, but just as an important intangible asset that creates long-term value for a company.
So we've talked about what frustrates you in this space. What gives you hope? You've worked in this space for quite a few years. Are you hopeful?
Yes, I am. So I think what does give me hope is there's a lot of energy but behind ESG or purpose or long-term value, whatever you want to call it. So 15 years ago, when I started working on this, I was really a lone wolf, not just academically, but also in the real world. To get practitioners to take you seriously, they were just not interested in this. But now it's not just academics who are working on this, but investors and companies are taking this really seriously. I think it's if you take the moral from the tortoise and the hare, I think people need more haste, less speed. In that we've gone from 0 to 100, but maybe the correct speed is 60. Is that now people are so excited about it and they're saying, "Oh, ESG is what every company and every investor should care about." Hang on a moment. Yes, it's important, but there are other things that are important. But I think you typically then move to some happy medium. It's like with a technology. Some people think, oh, this new technology is coming about. Let's say it's now ChatGPT. Let's try to use technology for everything. And then people realize, well, actually, technology is not perfect. There's certain things for which humans are important. And then you lead to a moderation. And hopefully, this is what we're going to have with ESG. It will seem mainstream, but it won't be put on a pedestal compared to other factors.
So much of what you have described is that ESG is not something in lieu of running a good business. It's not an either or, and it's not mutually exclusive to long term value. It is intrinsic to long term value and just as important, but no more important than all the other components of running a business.
Absolutely, and I should not take credit for this idea because like 31 years ago, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review about the balanced scorecard, and that says to understand the value of a business, we need a balanced scorecard of not only financial factors, but also non-financial factors. And it wasn't that one was better than the other, it's just that your knowledge of a company would be incomplete with only one or the
Mhm.
other. So to have some people who are tend to be on the right saying ESG is completely irrelevant, we should ban investors from taking ESG things into account, that's not correct. I don't think. But then others who might tend to be on the left and say, oh, we only care about ESG when a new director is appointed to the board. Is this person a minority? Rather than looking at his or her expertise, then I think that's also problematic.
So I'm hopeful that a year from now I can invite you back and we'll have another chat. What do you think we'll talk about in a year?
Well, I think in a year, hopefully you would have seen some of the moderation that I'm hoping for, because yes, you've had a lot of people push on the accelerator pedal, but you have seen a backlash against ESG, and I do think that this backlash is somewhat deserved and somewhat undeserved, and the undeserved part is sometimes people want to make a splash and create attention. But whenever you see an attack on ESG, often people's response are, let me try to dismiss and rebut this attack, when I think the first thing you should do is to ask, well, is any part of this attack actually correct? So one of the famous critiques was by Tariq Fancy. I wrote a response to it called, is sustainable investing really a dangerous placebo? Which was his charge. And I actually started by saying, well, actually, there are many aspects of his critique which are valid. And I think this should be the first place to start. And hopefully, now that we have some of these criticisms criticisms, there will be people who realize that some of these criticisms are valid, and therefore we should hopefully be in a more moderate position in a year's time.
Despite the US elections.
Well, there are unfortunately, I don't think that the US is unique in having polarization, sadly. I think that's true in my country, it's true in many other countries also.
So what's next for you? If we talk again in a year, what will you have worked on between now and then?
I'm actually just finished another book, which is on the topic that we've just talked about, polarization and extremism. So we haven't yet decided on a title. I think the two finalists at the moment are mastering misinformation or defeating deception. But that sort of gets to the idea of we want to make sure that when we look at data or information, it is based on the highest quality research rather than something which is just linked to our confirmation bias. And importantly, it highlights the importance of listening to views from both sides of the spectrum, because why do we get misinformed is we're only listening to one side. Actually, in many cases, there's truth in even the most sort of savage counterattack. So it'll be published by Penguin Random House. I'm really grateful that a mainstream trade publisher is going to be publishing the book. It should be out in probably about a year from now, so next spring. Those in the listeners who know my TED talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, it's loosely based on the idea of confirmation bias, how careful we need to be with data and evidence, particularly when it's on something that we feel strongly about, and so we're willing to lap up even a relatively weak study.
Incredible advice for all of us. And clearly, if that book is going to be released about a year from now, I think we're going to be talking again a year from now, if you're so willing.
Oh, I'd love to look forward to that conversation.
This has been incredibly insightful. I always love listening to you talk and provide your insights. So thank you very much, Professor Edmans. And we will talk again, if not before, we will talk again in a year.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me, Pam.
Bye-bye.